HarperCollins and Harper Audio present The Angel of Rome and Other Stories by Jess Walter, performed by Edoardo Ballerini and Julia Whelan.
Mr. Voice. Mother was a stunner. She was so beautiful, men would stop mid-step on the street to watch her walk by. When I was little, I would see them out of the corner of my eye and look back, my hand still in hers. Sometimes I'd wonder if the ogling man was my father, but I don't think the men ever saw me, and my mother didn't notice them, or pretended not to notice, or had stopped noticing. She'd simply pull my hand toward the Crescent, or the Bon Marché, or the fountain at Newberry's, wherever we were going that day. "Come on, Tanya, no dawdling." This could have been my mother's motto in 1974, no dawdling. I was 9 then, and Mother 31. She had 4 or 5 boyfriends at any given time. She eliminated them like murder suspects. We lived in a small apartment above a jewelry store where Mother worked as a greeter. I think the owner's theory was that men wouldn't dicker over carrots if my tall, striking, mini-skirted mother was looking over their shoulders. "Oh, that's beautiful. Your wife is very lucky." She seemed to have a date whenever she wanted one, at least 3 or 4 a week. I knew them by profession. "I'm seeing the pilot tonight," she would say from a cloud of hairspray, or with a dismissive roll of her eyes, "the lawyer's taking me to Sea Galley." Mother left me alone in the apartment when she went on these dates, and I fed myself and put myself to bed. But she was always there when I woke in the morning, sometimes hurrying the pilot or the lawyer out the door. After one of the men spent the night, I'd wonder if he might stick around for a while, but the next day he was gone, and in his place was a fireman or an accountant. Then, one day, Mother stopped dating entirely. She announced that she was marrying one of the men, a guy she'd been out with only 3 times by my count, Mr. Voice. He was a short, intense man with buggy eyes and graying hair that he wore long and mauve, his face framed by bushy sideburns and a thinning swoop across his big forehead. "You're marrying him?" I was confused. Mother always said that one day my father would return, that he was her one love, that what they had was special, and these other boyfriends were just placeholders until he came back. I didn't remember my father, and she wouldn't talk about him, where he lived or who he was, but she'd get this faraway look and make pronouncements like, "We'll always be together," and "He'll come back." Until then, she was just biding her time. Or so I thought. But then Mr. Voice came along. "What about my father?" I asked. We were packing up the apartment into grocery store boxes. "Your father?" She smiled gently. "Your father has got nothing to do with it. This is about making a home, a family for us." Wait, she was doing this for me? I didn't want her to make a family for us. I wanted to wait for my father. She set down the dishes she was packing and pushed the hair out of my eyes. "Listen to me, Tanya. You're a very pretty girl. You're going to be a beautiful woman. This is something you won't understand for a while, but your looks are like a bank account. You can save your whole life, but at some point you'll have to spend the money. Do you understand?" It was the only time I ever heard Mother talk about her looks this way. Something about it gave me a stomachache. I said I understood, but I didn't. Or maybe I did. Mr. Voice was 50 then, almost 20 years older than my mother. Although his name was Claude Almond, everyone knew him, and I mean everyone knew him, as Mr. Voice. This was the name on his business cards, the name in the phone book, the name on the big sign outside the studio he owned, the name people greeted him with on the street, mimicking his basso profundo. "Hey, Mr. Voice!" By the summer of 1974, when my mother married him, Claude was famous in our town, on every radio station on the dial, on TV commercials, at civic events, hosting variety shows. Mr. Voice's rumble narrated our daily life in Spokane, Washington.
Looking for AM/FM deluxe turntable, 8-track stereo speaker sound with psychedelic lights that rocked the music? Come to Wall of Sound Waterbed on East Sprague, next to the Two Swabbies. Starlight Stairway is presented once again this week in vivid color by Boyle Fuel. If you need coal or oil, call Boyle. This weekend at Spokane Raceway Park, we've got the West's best funny cars, Kettleson's Mad Dog Dodge Dart, Kip's Killer Cuda, and the Burns Aqua Velvo Wheelie Truck. Your ears are gonna bleed.
That was Mr. Voice. Even now, I remember their wedding more clearly than I remember either of my own. Mother wore a magenta mini dress, and she put me in a dress that matched it. In hindsight, perhaps not something a 9-year-old should wear. "I think people can see my underwear," I said. "At least you're wearing them," she said, tugging at her own skirt. Our long brown hair was fixed the same, too, smooth as poured syrup behind headbands high on our heads, bangs shiny and combed straight. I got to wear lipstick for the first time, a lacquered coat of pink that made my lips look like 2 candles. I was Mother's only bridesmaid. Claude had 4 children from his first marriage, but only his youngest, Brian, who was 16, stood with him, in a chocolate tuxedo that matched his father's. He had these sleepy eyes behind big, black-framed glasses, and a shock of hair that looked like a wave about to crash. They were married at the end of the 1974 World's Fair in Spokane. Such was Claude's celebrity that the TV stations covered it, and there was a picture in the Spokesman Review. Local radio host married at Expo. The wedding was in a little outdoor theater in the Round on Canada Island, and a judge friend of Claude's performed the ceremony. While we waited for the bride to emerge, Claude stood smoking a pipe in his chocolate tux and ruffled white shirt. He was talking to a couple of businessmen in gray suits when he saw me. He walked over and looked down at me with those bug eyes of his.
"Listen, Tanya,"
he rumbled.
"I know this happened fast for you. I just want you to know I'm not trying to replace anyone. You don't have to call me Dad. You can call me Claude if you want. Or Mr. Voice."
This was the first real conversation we'd ever had, and it was confusing, that omnipresent radio voice telling me I didn't have to call him Dad. Then Claude kissed the top of my head and returned to the men in suits. Behind me, someone spoke, mimicking Claude's thundering bass.
"Listen, whatever your name is."
I turned. It was Claude's son, Brian, doing a practiced impersonation of his father.
"You can call me dipshit if you want, or dickhead douchebag."
Then he smiled and rolled his eyes. Mom and Claude had written their own vows, New Age hippie gibberish about being mate and muse to one another and sharing soul and sinew. Not until death do they part, but as long as we grow and glow. The judge pronounced them man and wife. They shared an uncomfortably long kiss, and then they walked down the aisle to applause. I tugged at my skirt and followed with my new stepbrother, who gracefully offered his arm. I took it.
"Don't mind me,"
Brian said.
"I always puke at weddings."
Claude had a big, sprawling rancher on the back end of Spokane's old money South Hill, with an open floor plan and a built-in hi-fi system connected to intercoms in every room. He loved that intercom system. You could hear every word spoken in that thin-walled house, but Claude still insisted on using the intercoms. I'd be reading or playing dolls, and there would be a hiss of static, and then,
"Tanya, have you finished your language arts? Tanya, Wild Kingdom is on. Tanya, dinner's ready. London broil."
We ate in a mauve kitchen overlooking a shag-carpeted, powder-blue sunken living room. On the other end was a hallway with 3 bedrooms lining it, Mom and Claude's, mine, and every other weekend, Brian's. In the A-frame center of the house, the walls didn't go all the way to the ceiling, contributing to the open feel of the house and to some of the worst memories of my childhood. Such was the combination of Claude's vocal power and 1970s home construction that I could hear every sordid thing that happened in the master bedroom the first year of their marriage. Claude's voice must have been key to their foreplay because he narrated their sex life the way he did the weekend stock car races.
Dance those ripe tomatoes over here. Baby. Yeah. Mr. Voice digs his little hippie girl.
Claude apparently liked to role-play, too, because sometimes I'd hear bits and pieces of various bedroom radio dramas, like Pirate and Wench.
Prepare to be boarded, my lady.
Or Stern British Headmaster.
Oh, someone has been a bloody bad girl.
He'd play Tom Jones or Robert Goulet records, miming them, I think, and then pretend Mother was a groupie.
What's new, pussycat? Did Kitty like the concert tonight?
I never heard my mother's voice during these sex games, and based on how quickly Claude emerged from their bedroom in his short silk robe afterward, the sex itself was less involved than Claude's narration leading up to it. Sometimes I hid under a pillow to block the actual words, but there was no hiding from the rumble of his voice in that house. Mr. Voice was everywhere then. In my 10th year, I couldn't escape him informing me there was
strawberry shortcake for whoever cleans their plate,
or on the hi-fi radio telling me to
get on down to Appliance Roundup for the rodeo of savings,
or calling my mother
my foxy cheerleader.
One night, they were playing some kind of Roman orgy game.
Pluck another grape into my mouth, house girl.
When my bedroom door flew open. This was Claude's custodial weekend, and in the doorway stood my stepbrother Brian, looking alarmed. Without a word, he took me by the hand, pulled me into his bedroom, and sat me on the floor in front of his stereo.
Listen,
he said.
Anytime I'm not here and that shit starts up, you can just come in my room, okay?
Then he put his black stereo headphones on my ears and cranked up the music. Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I closed my eyes and played with the springy chord while I listened. Halfway through the song, Wooden Ships became, in my mind, the story of Brian and me. Go take your sister, then, by the hand. I opened my eyes. Brian was sitting on his bed, cross-legged, filling some kind of pipe with brownish-green mulch that I intuited must be marijuana. I took the headphones off. Immediately, I could hear Claude's voice, more distant than it had been in my room, but still sonorous and rich.
Oh, you like that, naughty girl?
Honestly, it's not the sex, Brian said. It's the acting that offends me. Then he looked up at me and cocked his head. You really do look like her, he said. Back then, I heard this a lot. I would stare at my face in the mirror and wonder, did I really? Everyone said she was beautiful. Did that mean I was, too? Would my father recognize me if he saw me? Would I have 50 boyfriends and then, one day, cash out my good looks like a bank account? What made a person beautiful, anyway? Mother had 2 eyes, eyebrows, a nose, a mouth, just like anyone. I felt chubby and had a spray of freckles across my nose. Would I get tall like her? Would the spots on my face go away? Would her face become mine? What did that word even mean, beautiful? But that day, I was ecstatic to be told that I looked like her. I put the headphones back on, smiled, and closed my eyes to listen to the song, We Are Leaving, and I smelled pot smoke for the first time that afternoon. You Don't Need Us, as Claude finished his business with his intransigent servant girl. Not long after it started, no more than a year, the sex part seemed to end for Mother and Claude, or at least the loud overacting that often preceded the sex ended. I wondered if my mother just had enough, or maybe Brian said something to them about the thin walls. Having been married twice myself in the 40 years since that time, I know that a marriage can just settle into a domestic lull, too, and maybe that's what happened with Mother and Mr. Voice. Still, I can't recall a happier, more peaceful time than the second year of my mother's marriage to Claude. Unlike in our old routine in the apartment downtown, she was home every day when I returned from school, and every night when I went to bed. She had quit her jewelry store job, and she embraced the domestic life, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry. She even dressed like a mother, her skirt slowly moving down her thighs to her knees. One day, I got dressed for school and asked what had happened to the jumper I was wearing. It was strangely stiff. "Oh, I ironed it," Mother said. Ironing. Who knew? Claude seemed happy, too, or at least busy. He had just started a brand new business,
Mr. Voice is going national,
in which he read and recorded books, Bible stories, westerns, and thrillers, mostly for long-haul truck drivers.
Every new semi-truck has a cassette tape player, he said, and I will be in all of them.
Claude worked with a partner named Lowell, a lawyer whose job it was to secure the rights to the books. I loved Claude's new job because it meant I no longer heard him on the radio or TV all the time. He was not Mr. Voice anymore, but my stepfather, helping with my homework and pulling the last of my loose teeth. I don't know if it was the new business, but Claude seemed to age a decade in the year he developed Mr. Voice's stories on cassette. His swoop of hair disappeared in front. What was left on the sides and back was long and gray. With the round glasses he'd begun wearing, Claude looked like Benjamin Franklin. He and my mother began to look more like father and daughter than husband and wife. That year, Brian spent more time at the house, too, which I liked a great deal. He'd started out being distant toward Mother, but she was nothing if not persistent, and nothing if not charming, and she instituted a campaign to get him to like her, complimenting his clothes and his hair, and making his favorite food, tacos, at least once a week. She called him Bry Guy and ruffled his hair at the dinner table. Brian played guitar in a little two-man band with a high school buddy, a drummer named Clay, and Mother encouraged them to set up a practice space in the garage. Clay was tall and dark-haired, with an intense stare, and something about the attention that Mother showed him made me a little uncomfortable. "Well, if it isn't young Clay," she'd gush, or, "Clay, how is it that you get handsomer every time I see you?" That spring, Mother set up guitar lessons for Brian with a guy she knew named Alan, who was the guitarist in a local band called Treason. I remembered Alan as one of the men she'd dated during her no-dawdling phase, one of the murder suspects, as I used to think of them, the musician. A greasy guy with long blonde hair who would come pick up Mother on a motorcycle and take her to a downtown club called Washboard Willie's. But he must have been a great guitar teacher, because Brian really improved. I loved it when Brian got serious about the guitar. I'd sit on the floor of his bedroom while he played the beginning of Stairway to Heaven or the intro to Layla. Brian's voice was, unlike his father's, thin and reedy, but I still held my breath when he sang, and sometimes he'd sneak my name in there, in the chorus to the Allman Brothers' Melissa. But back home, he'll always run to sweet Tanya. One day, I was in my room doing homework when I heard Mother and Brian come in the door from guitar lessons. I hopped off my bed and ran toward the hall just as the door slammed. Brian stomped past me and threw his guitar in his bedroom closet. Mother went into the kitchen and lit a cigarette. I lingered outside Brian's door, waiting to hear him play whatever song he'd worked on that day with Alan, but he just sat on his bed and opened a book. He said he was done with guitar. "Why?" I asked. "Because guitar is for assholes," he said, looking up from his book and glancing past me toward the kitchen. "What about Clay?" I asked. What about the band?
There is no band, he snapped.
I backed out of his room. That night at dinner, Brian couldn't bring himself to look at Mother, and she seemed nervous around him. They both stared at their plates while Claude rambled on about the story he'd taped that day, a novel about a sheriff who shoots an outlaw and ends up caring for the dead man's horse. Claude was clueless about whatever was going on. Meanwhile, I was furious with Mother. Something had clearly happened, and I sensed it had something to do with her. If she drove Brian away, I would never forgive her. The next day, Mother searched Brian's room, found his marijuana pipe, and confronted Claude with it when he got home from work. From my room, I could hear them arguing.
I won't have this in my house, she said. What if he's smoking it around Tanya?
I'll talk to him, Claude said. It's a confusing time for young people.
Confusing? Mother scoffed. Your son is a druggie, and I don't want him around Tanya. That's final.
Linda, be reasonable.
They went back and forth like this. I walked down to Brian's room, ran my hand over his guitar, put on Wooden Ships, and settled under his headphones. Sometimes your life changes in big, dramatic ways, as though you've been cast in a play you don't remember auditioning for. Moments have the power of important scenes, being paraded in a tiny purple dress at a wedding, someone putting headphones on you and playing a rock song. But other scenes occur offstage, and you wake one morning and understand that one thing is now something else. This was how it happened that in the summer of 1976, just before my 12th birthday, Mother ran off with Brian's guitar teacher, Alan. I don't recall anyone telling me that it happened, or any great argument or a fight between her and Claude. I didn't even get to say goodbye. I just recall suddenly understanding why Brian had quit the guitar and knowing that Treason was going on the road to open for a larger band and that Mother was going with them. I was furious with her, much angrier, it seems to me now, than Claude was. But there's a fogginess I feel about that period, too, a disorientation that makes it hard to remember. Maybe it was the shock of what happened, or maybe it was the fog of adolescence. Since that time, I have witnessed this transformation in my own daughters, that intense dawning of self-awareness that causes teenagers to tune out the rest of the world. A child's powers of observation must be strongest, I think, between 8 and 11. By 13, we can't see past ourselves. Whatever the cause, I just remember smoothly moving from living with my mother and Claude to living alone with Claude. We developed a quiet, easy relationship. We ate dinner and watched TV together. On Tuesday nights, after I finished my homework, Claude would make popcorn, and we'd watch Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley. When Marshall Doyle asked me to go with him at school, Claude explained what that meant and gave me the words to tell him no thank you. When my period arrived, Claude took me to the store for tampons and explained the basics of female reproduction and human sexuality to me, something Mother had failed to do. Thankfully, in his sex talk, he didn't say anything about pirates or naughty schoolgirls or Robert Goulet. Brian came over a lot that year. He was taking classes at Spokane Falls Community College, and we all had dinner together at least twice a week. I was in middle school and could feel myself changing. My arms seemed to grow overnight, my shirts became tight, cuffs of my pants rose off the floor. I retired my teen form trainer and rummaged through Mother's box of old Playtexes and maiden forms until I found a few that fit, a soft white one, a sheer lime green one, and a flesh-colored 1960s bullet bra that I only wore once. It was around that time that I also became aware of boys and men watching me more attentively. There was a heaviness in their stares, a pressure that I recognized with both discomfort and familiarity, as if I'd been expecting it all along. This was how it felt to be her, to feel as if you were on stage. I recalled her mannerisms, the way she managed the attention while feigning indifference, and I worked to master each of her old moves, a glance away at just the right time, a tilt of the head and a lift of the eyes, a laughing flip of hair from my shoulder. But as boys began to notice me, the one I most wanted to see me, Brian, still thought of me as a kid. He called me Little T and Turd Bird. I thought of him as I dressed each morning. Would Brian like this skirt, this blouse, these jeans? When I started wearing makeup to look older, he made it clear he wasn't a fan.
You got some shit on your face, Turd Bird.
Tall, intense Clay had started hanging around again, too, and if Brian didn't notice me, Clay certainly did.
Man, someone's growing up,
he'd say, and Brian would look at me as if this couldn't possibly be right. Then he'd grunt reluctantly, I guess so, or yuck. That's how I started flirting with Clay. It was another thing I'd seen Mother do, charm a man through his friend. I'd hear them setting up Clay's drum kit in the garage, and I'd put on a pair of shorts and go out to the garage, get on my bicycle, and pedal slowly away. Bye, Brian. Bye, Clay. Clay would watch me right away, smiling with half of his mouth, while Brian tuned his guitar. I could sense their eyes moving, Clay's to me, Brian's to Clay, then Brian's to me. It was not a plan, as such, but I'm sure some part of me intuited that the way to Brian was through jealousy of his best friend. I also knew it was weird to be in love with your own stepbrother, and I held the secret deep inside, ashamed and worried it meant I was a pervert. I was usually home alone for a couple of hours after school, and sometimes I'd go into Brian's room and look through his clothes and albums, imagining he was there. I was doing that one day when I heard the doorbell ring. I ran to the front door, opened it, and there was Clay.
Hey, Tanya,
he said, his eyes traveling up and down like he was watching a yo-yo.
Brian's not here, I said. He's at his mom's.
I tried to be cooler than usual since Brian wasn't around to make jealous, but later I would wonder, did I tilt my head, shift my hip? Was it my fault?
Oh,
Clay said. Then,
shit.
He glanced back at his blue Nova, skulking in our driveway.
So you're here alone?
I stared at my shoes.
Yeah, but Claude will be home from work pretty soon.
He asked if he could use our phone, and when I said yes, he followed me into the house, a bit too close, it seemed, and when we got to the kitchen, I took the phone off the wall, turned, and handed it to him. But he hung the phone up.
I forgot the number.
Then he moved closer to me, backing me up until I was against the wall.
Clay,
I put my hand on his chest, the way I remembered Mother doing, a way of touching someone that also kept a bit of distance. But he just kept coming closer, pressing me against the wall. He kissed me, not the way boys my age kissed, but as if he was trying to pry me open with his tongue. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine I was kissing Brian, but it wasn't right. I didn't imagine Brian kissing like this. Clay's hands moved all over me, squeezed and pinched, and I thought, does he know I'm only 13? What 19-year-old boy wants to do this with someone who's only 13? Wasn't that gross? I pushed a little harder on his chest.
Clay, I don't...
But he just kissed me harder, mashing my lips against my teeth. He sucked at my neck and said,
Don't tell me you don't want it, the way you look.
I couldn't make sense of his words. Don't tell? Want what? Look how? What? Later, of course, you question yourself. Was I allowing this? Did I do something? But it was so fast. His hands insistent, quick, aggressive, like I was fighting a war on two fronts. I would stop his right hand from mashing my left breast, and his left hand would be moving up my right inner thigh. The whole time his tongue was stuck deep in my mouth. Don't tell, don't want, way you look. He pulled me to the kitchen floor, his weight on top of me. I tried to deflect him long enough to think, but there was no time for thoughts, just the battle of those hands. I stopped the right, and the left undid my bra. I stopped the left, and the right jammed itself down the front of my jeans. I gripped his right forearm, but his fingers